description. So I can just recap a bit. So this is ALM powered by Azure DevOps. As I've just explained, that Azure DevOps will be powering our ALM journey, and it makes life easier for us developers and for DevOps engineers themselves to make build pipelines and then execute them. So Azure will be the platform that will be using going forward. And then these are the three key components that I just highlighted about. The first one being solutions, which are in short packages for all of our components, which can be apps, chatbots, entities, fields, or any kind of stuff that you have on Power Platform. They can all be bundled into one solution, and then those solutions will be used for exporting and importing into various environments. The next key component is Dataverse, that we'll be using to store all the artifacts, including our solutions, since it's the base platform, fundamental platform for all of Power Platform, the underlying layer. So Dataverse will be key component for this ALM journey. And then the next key component would be source control. Now, source control will be our only source of truth for having the basic code and all of the solutions unpacked. So we'll be using source control. We'll dump our unpacked solutions over to source control, and then we'll be using source control as the source of truth for packing our solutions back into a managed solution and then exporting those managed solutions over to our test environment or to our prod environment. So source control will also be crucial for this process. Now let's go ahead. This is the diagram that I was explaining earlier. So this is the high level architecture or kind of framework that you can say that this is how usually developers and engineers are working with Power Platform. So this here, right here on the right, is our development environment. This is mostly a sandbox environment where we are working, we are testing things, we are making code changes, and we are creating test dummy data over here. So this is just a sandbox environment. This is where most we developers are working most of the time. And then once we are satisfied with what we have on the development environment, then we push all of that, we pull all of that into a solution package, which is just a container for all of our code elements and our components. And then once that solution is ready, we check that solution in over to source control. And on the source control side, we'll have the ability to track changes. We'll get all the benefits that we usually have with source control systems. We'll be able to see who checked in this code and when this code was changed. We can also see the previous code iterations. If you overwrite something and you want that back, then you don't have it on the Power Platform. But if you have implemented ALM, then you can still have it on your source control system. So then from the source control system, we'll pack that solution, and then we'll push that solution over to our test environment or our production environment. So that is where that we'll be conducting our UATs on test environment, and then eventually when we are satisfied on the test environment, then we move that solution over to the production environment, which is the live environment. So this is the whole process that we'll be trying to refine and make easy with our ALM journey. So let's go ahead next. This is the tool which will help us to actually realize all our ALM dreams. And this is Microsoft's effort to make our lives easier. They have done all the hard work for us. This is an extension for Azure DevOps. And once you install this, you have multiple tasks available for the Power Platform, which can help you build and then execute your Power Platform build jobs. And through this extension, we can easily create pipelines which can help us run our DevOps flows and deploy to other environments. So let's go ahead. The first pipeline that we'll be building will be the one which will export our solutions from our dev environment and then check those solutions source codes into the Git. So this is the first step where we'll be taking our solution from the dev, we'll be unpacking the solution, and then we'll be pushing
Yeah.
the unpacked solution code over to Git.
Mohsen, I think your slides are not moving, so we are on the what we can see is slide 6 over here right now.
Okay, wait, let me reshare the screen.
Yep.
Is the screen visible now?
It is, yes.
Am I on slide 7 now?
You are, yes. Thanks.
Okay, okay. Thank you for telling me. Okay, so I have gone through slide 7 in detail twice now, so you will know what I'm talking about here. These are the build tools that we'll be using on Azure. Next, this is the first pipeline that I was explaining earlier. This is the first pipeline that we'll be building in order to accomplish our ALM journey. We'll be exporting a managed solution from our dev environment or our sandbox environment, and then we'll unpack that solution and check it into our source control system, which is Azure's source control system. And then this is the task which will be achieved by this pipeline, and the further task will be achieved by another pipeline. And now I'll get into detail why we are splitting this into two pipelines that I'll get into later. So this is what the first pipeline will look like once it is complete. The steps of how to achieve this and how to make this will be going into detail a little bit later, but this is what it will look like once it is complete. So this pipeline has three steps: the Power Platform tool installer, the Power Platform export solution step, Power Platform unpack solution step, and then eventually the last command line script, which commits this unpack solution files over to our Git repository, where our code will be stored for future reference when we are exporting that code over to other environments. So this is the first pipeline. Now moving on to the next pipeline, what the second pipeline will aim to accomplish is that it will take the solution source files which are present on our source control system, our repository, which we did in the first pipeline, and then it will take those source files, it will pack those source files into one solution, a managed solution, and then that managed solution will be imported to whatever environment you tell it to, like the test environment or the production environment. So this is what the second pipeline will aim to achieve. This is how the second pipeline will look like once it is all complete. It will deploy a managed solution from Git to test. And the three steps involved are: first, the tool installer, then the pack solution step, which will pack our solution from source code and make a solution file, and then the third step, which is the import solution, which will use that solution file and import that solution file over to our other environments. So this is what we'll be aiming to achieve. Now let's get into the details. Let's get into the build process. So first of all, before getting started, the first prerequisite that we have is, since that we're using Azure DevOps for all of this, we need an Azure DevOps project set up, and we need to have an Azure account. We need to have a Microsoft account with the required licenses. So you can go to this link that's appearing on the screen right now, and you can click on the start free option. And then you'll need to sign in with the Microsoft account if you haven't already done so. And then you can start a project by creating a new project, and this will be the project where our pipeline and where our repository will reside. So this will be our main project for this ALM journey. So on to the next slide. This is an example of how I built a project on Azure DevOps. This is the created project. I've named it Learning and Development for the uh, sake of this presentation. So this is what you will end up with once you do these steps and you create a new project over on Azure DevOps. Once you have this project set up, if you can look in the left taskbar, you have these two options which we'll be concerned with today. One is the repos option, where our Git repository will reside, and the other is the pipelines option, where our build pipelines will reside. Now let's go ahead. Next, we'll need to install the Power Platform build tools for Azure DevOps. As I've previously explained, these tools will help us out in achieving this ALM journey that we are going on. So this is the tools that you need to install, and in order to do that, you can go over to this link, and you will be greeted with this screen where this has a big green button which says get it free, and you will click on this, and this will ask you to choose your organization in which you want to install these tools. So you will have to choose your Azure DevOps organization in which you want to install these build tools. And once you choose that organization, like for me, I have chosen my organization, which is Imperium Dynamics. You can install these tools into your environment, and then you're good to go. Now we have our project set up, and we have the build tools installed. So naturally, the next step would be to have the repository set up, where we'll be pushing our source code. So to do that, As I've showed you earlier, you can go into this left bar, sidebar, and you can go into the repos option. When you go into the repos option on a new project, it will show you this screen indicating that there are no repos currently initialized on this project. So you need to initialize one. So what we'll do is we'll go over to the bottom of this page and we'll go to this option which says initialize main branch with a readme or git ignore. So you can change this option. You can add or don't not add a readme according to your preference. You can add or not add a git ignore according to your preference. But then eventually we want to initialize a clean branch, a new branch, and new repository on this project, which we've set up for this presentation and for our ALM workflow. So once we initialize this repository, we will now have an empty repository initialized on this project, and this is how it will look like when you go to the file section of this repository. And this is how you will be you this is how your screen will be, and this repository will eventually be used for our source code. So let's go ahead to the next step. Now, in the next step, this gets a little bit complicated, but it is necessary, so we'll have to follow along. In the next step, we'll have to allow Azure to actually access this repository. Since these repositories are security protected, so the build pipeline that we'll be building will be accessing this repository to push the code. To access this repository, it needs a certain privilege and permission in order to be able to access this repository. So these are the steps that we'll have to take in order to create or grant that permission to our build pipelines. And what we'll need to do is we'll need to click on this gear icon on the bottom left of your screen. And once you're there, you have to click on this repositories option in this menu. Once you're in this repositories option, just select whatever repository that you have just created. The name can be anything. You can rename it according to your preference. And once you have selected that repository, then you need to go into the security tab, and then in the search bar over here, you have to search for project collection build service. Once you search for this, you will see an entry, a user group with this name, and in the brackets ahead, you'll have your organization's name, which is your organization name on Azure DevOps. So once you have this on your screen, you select this option, and then you change the contribute permission of this user and you set it to allow. Once you set it to allow, then what it does it is that it allows the build service of this project, which we'll be using in our pipeline. That build service can now access this repository and it can contribute to this repository. So this is what we want to achieve through this step. So if you have followed along, you will be able to do this very easily. Now let's go over to our other document which I have for the next steps in creating this pipeline. So let me share my screen again. Just hang with me for a bit. Okay, so now I hope we have this screen visible where you see a Word document on your screen. This is a blog that I have written for my organization, and it will be up on our organization's website, so you can check it out later even if you miss this presentation, or you can just go through this blog in this presentation when I'll be going through it. So now the next step, once we have all of the stuff set up, we have our Azure project set up, we have our Azure repository set up, we have granted the required privileges to our Azure build service. So we have everything set up. Now we need to get into the meat of things, and we need to create the first pipeline that will execute things for us. So to do that, first you can go into pipeline section, and then there will be a button which will tell you to create your first pipeline. You click on that pipeline, and now first of all it will ask you which type of editor, which type of connector would you like to use to create your pipeline. So for this we'll be using the classic editor. So click on this option, use the classic editor, and then the next screen will be this one, which will ask you to select which repository you want to link with this pipeline. And in our case, we'll be linking our Azure repos Git. This will be the repository which we'll be using. And by the way, this is the default option. We'll be using this since we're using the whole Azure platform. So we'll be residing our repository over in this Azure repository. You can also use your own personal or your work GitHub repositories or Bitbucket repositories or any other Git versioning system that you have. You can configure them and they will be as easy to configure as this Azure repos here. So we'll be using this Azure repos for this demonstration purpose. So once you have selected this Azure repository, you will select the project that you're currently on, and then you'll select the repository that you just would have created in the few steps earlier. So you will select that repository, and the default branch for this purpose of this demonstration will be the main branch that will be initialized when you started, you initialized your repository. So this will be the branch that we'll be using, the main branch. And then if you click on continue, this will be the screen that you'll be presented with. And here you will have to choose what template you want to start your pipeline with. And for that purpose, we'll be starting with an empty job and we'll be building it from scratch. So we'll start with an empty job and then we can go ahead and start building our pipeline. The next screen will be this screen where we have the whole information about the pipeline, and it will ask you to tell, it will give you an option to rename your pipeline. So you can rename the pipeline according to whatever purpose your pipeline achieves. The first pipeline that we want to implement will be the one which exports solution from our dev environment over and checks it into our Git environment. So you can name it accordingly. You can name it export from dev to Git, and that is sufficient enough to indicate what that pipeline tries to achieve. So once you rename your pipeline from this section in the name section, then you can go ahead and click on the save and queue button, which will show a drop down. And from that drop down, you can click on that save button. So now our pipeline is saved and it is initialized. Now we have to add tasks into this pipeline, which will run when we actually execute this pipeline. So as you can see here, we have just one job on our pipeline, which says agent job one, and this is the default job which is created for you whenever you create a pipeline. Since we'll only be working in a linear fashion, so we won't be needing multiple jobs. So we'll just focus on this one job and we'll add all our tasks on this one job. For more advanced scenarios, you can create multiple jobs. Now let's go ahead. The first thing that we'll need to do is, one error that you might face once we're done with all of this and we have our pipeline completed and then you run your pipeline, then there might be one error which says that your pipeline cannot access the token, the OAuth token. So that I've highlighted here. So you can do this step in the beginning of the process, so you will save yourself from some headache and this error won't likely appear to you. So you can click on this agent job one, and once you have clicked on this agent job one, this will be the details of this job one. And if you scroll down, you will see these additional options. Now from here, you should click on this checkbox. You should check this checkbox which says allow scripts to access the OAuth token. I think it should be clearly visible to you now. So we have to check this checkbox and allow the scripts to access the OAuth token. So this is how we avoid the error that would have popped up if we didn't do this step. So now let's move on. Now we have to get into the actual building of the pipeline and where we'll be implementing our actual ALM practices. And these pipelines can differ. This pipeline is just for demonstration purpose to let you know how to actually get into ALM and get into Azure DevOps and make your lives easier. But this is not conclusive. This is not the whole thing. You can go ahead and customize it. You can go ahead and extend it to up to your liking, up to your level of technical knowledge. So this is just the basic stuff, and this will help you get into ALM with Power Platform. So once we are here, we have granted that OAuth token access. Then we click on this plus icon here, which allows us to add tasks to this job. Since this job is empty now, it does not mean anything. We'll need to add tasks to it, which run when the pipeline executes. So we'll click on this plus button. This will show this screen, and then we need to add a task. So to add all our tasks, what we'll be doing is common. We'll be going to the search bar up here and we'll type Power Platform. So this filters out all the tasks and shows us only the ones which belong to the Power Platform build tools. So once we have these tasks over here, the first task that we'll be adding is Power Platform Tool Installer. Now, what this task does is that it installs the tools that Power Platform that come bundled with the Power Platform build tools, which are required for the other tasks to function correctly. So this is the fundamental step and the crucial step that we'll be needing to do, and we'll add this task over here. Now, one question that may arise, and you may wonder, that why are we installing the tools every time the pipeline runs? Because if we add this task to the pipeline, and then whenever we run the pipeline, all of these tasks get executed. So one may question themselves that why do we have to install these tools every time the pipeline runs? We can just do it once. So the answer for that is that whenever you run a pipeline, Azure spins up a new virtual machine for you, which is the machine on which these tasks run. So it is not a one common machine, or it is not your personal desktop, personal machine, personal server, which has these tools already installed for once, and then you can run the rest of the steps. So this is not the case. It Azure, whenever you run a pipeline, it spins up a new virtual machine. It creates a fresh state for you. So in that fresh state, you will always require to install these Power Platform tools every time, each and every time you execute your pipeline. So this is the answer why we need to do this step each time. So first we'll add this step. We'll click on the add button and it will add this task to our pipeline. Now, the next step that we'll need to do is, once we have these tools installed, then we need to export our solution from our environment, from our dev environment, our sandbox environments. We'll need to export our solution. So the next step that we'll be adding, next task that we'll be adding, will be the Power Platform export solution task. And once we have added this task, then it will also need some configuration. Now, in order to configure this, this requires some settings, the first of which being the service connection. Now, the service connection we'll have to manage. You have to click on this manage button over here, and then when you click this manage button, you will be greeted with this page, which lets you create your service connection. Now, in order for the pipeline to communicate with your Dataverse instance, you'll need to make a service connection, and that is what we'll be doing in this step. So it requires a few parameters from your side, which will allow the connection to connect to your Dataverse instance. The first one being the server URL. This is different for everyone that implements this. This server URL will be the URL to your Dataverse environment, your Power Apps environment, and where you can find that is, you can go to admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com, then log in with your organization's email address, and once you have logged in, you can go to the environments tab. Once you have gone to the environments tab, then you have to select the environment for which you want to set up a pipeline. And once you're in that screen which shows you that particular environment, then under the URL title, you will have this environment URL label which you are looking for. This URL will be the one which goes here over in the server URL section. And once you have that added, then there's the authentication section. In the authentication section, you'll have to provide your credentials for your account, which will be the username and password. And once you're done with this, you can name your service connection. For demonstration purposes, I have named it sample connection for now. You can name it whatever you want to, and add some description which describes this connection. Once you're done with all of these steps, you just click on the save button, and then you're good to go. This connection will be completed. Now this window opens up in a new tab, so you'll have to go back to your previous tab where you were editing your pipeline, where this screen was showing. Now, once you are back here on this screen, then you have to click on this refresh button. This button. This is the button I'm talking about. The service connection label. You click on this refresh button, then this drop down populates again. And in this drop down, you will have to select the newly created service connection that you just created. Now, once you have selected this, then you type in your solution name and your solution output file. Now, I'll describe what we'll be typing there. For the solution name, we'll be adding a variable and we'll be typing this text, dollar bracket solution name. Now what this does is that it means that you are pointing to a variable. This is a variable that we'll define in our pipeline in some later steps. So in the second section of the solution name section, we'll just add this. And then in the solution output field, solution output file field, we'll add this text over here. Now what this text is that first it's pointing to a variable which is a build variable. It is the artifact staging directory. This is where our artifacts will be stored. What is an artifact? An artifact is any file that you create during this whole build process. So the solution file is also an artifact. So we'll be putting that artifact into this artifact staging directory, and followed by our solution name dot zip. So this will be the file of our managed solution, file name of our managed solution, which will be solution name.zip. Now, artifact direct staging directory build variable. This is defined by Microsoft. Since it's a predefined variable, you don't have to define it yourself. So Microsoft defines it as the following: the local path on the agent where any artifacts are copied to before being pushed to their destination. So this is where you temporarily keep your artifacts, and then you push those over to your other environments. And please note that the artifact staging directory, it is cleared with every build. So once your build pipeline is complete running, this directory is cleared, so you won't have those files that you created during your execution inside this directory. So they are just temporary files. So once we are done with this, this is how this step will finally look like. For the solution name field, we have the solution name variable, and for the solution output file field, we have this builds.artifact staging directory slash solution name.zip text. And you can also check in this box, which is export as managed solution, since we want to be exporting our managed solution. Now it is showing an error on the solution name file. This is because we haven't defined the variable yet, the solution name variable, which we'll be doing in the next steps later on in this demonstration. So we'll look into it later on. So now once we have this step completed, what this step will do is that it will take the solution from our dev environment and it will export it as solution name.zip file, and it will keep this on this directory. So now we'll have our solution file on this directory, which we'll be using to unpack and store into Git. So the next step will be to add the unpack solution task. We'll add the task using the same steps that we followed before. Click on plus, search, and then pick this unpack solution step. Now this also requires some configurations. The first configuration being the input file. Now for the solution input file, we'll use the same directory and the same file name which we use for the solution output file in the previous step. The output from this export solution step will become the input to this unpack solution step. So we'll just copy the same over here, and then the next field will be to add the target folder where we need to unpack the solution. So we'll be using another build variable, which is the sources directory. This build variable is used to just unpack the code, and you can store your source code, unpacked source code, in this directory. So this is what this step looks like after it's complete. And please note, please change this unmanaged solution to managed solution, since we'll be working with managed solutions. Once we're done with this, the next task that we want to add is the command line task. And in this command line task, we'll be actually putting in the commands which will push these solution files over to Git. And now in this, we'll add this command line task. Once this is here, you can look how it looks like when it's complete. Once you add this command line task, you can rename it from the display name field. I've renamed it to push to Git, because since this command line task actually pushes our source code over to Git. And then you have to put in the actual script over here. So this is the script which we'll use to push our code over to our Git repository. And you can look into the code over here. You have to change a few things in this script. The first thing that you'll need to change is this thing. This is the user email. This is just example at domain.com. You'll have to put in your actual email, actual organization email into this. And then this is the branch that we'll be checking out. This is the main branch, because this is the default branch that was initialized when we initialized our repository. And then we commit this code over to our repository, and then we push this code to our repository. And this line, it allows authorization for accessing this repository through the bearer token. And here we use the system variable, which is the system access token. This allows us to work with security, and this is the token which will allow us to actually access the repository. So we use this token as the bearer token, and this is the authorization header that we'll have to add in this git script. So by this script, we can push our code, the unpacked solution files from this solution file folder, the sources directory, over to our git repository. Now this is how this it will look like once it is all complete. And after this step, we have now completed this first pipeline, and this pipeline is done, and this pipeline will do as it was meant to do. It will pick up our solution from our dev environment, and then it will unpack that solution in the next step, and then those unpacked solution source code files it will push over to our git repository. And this is all achieved by this first pipeline. Now if you recall, we have second pipeline as well, where we'll be using this unpacked solution file and packing it and then deploying it over to our test environment. Now why we have split these pipelines into two is because this first pipeline, which just pushes to git, you'll ideally be wanting to execute this pipeline a lot more, because you will constantly be pushing to git with every major change. With every change, let's say at the end of each working day, you just execute this pipeline which updates your code over on your git repository. This you will be wanting to run more occasionally. But the other pipeline which will actually pick that code up and deploy it over to your test environment or prod environment, that pipeline you want to be running only occasionally and sometimes on whenever you want to actually deploy to those environments. So that is why we have split these pipelines into two, for the sake of running one more frequently than the other. So once we have done this, our pipeline is complete. But one step that we are missing here, if you recall, we added those solution name variable and we used it throughout our pipeline, but we have not defined it yet. So you will have to go into this variables tab up here, and then you have to select pipeline variables. You have to click on this add button, and then you can add this solution name variable here. It has to read exactly this solution name, and then the value should be your solution name. This is just for demonstration purposes. This is sample solution name. This should be replaced with the actual solution name that you have over in your Dataverse environment. So once we're done with this, you can extract your solution name from your Dataverse environment. If this is your make.powerapps portal, once you are on this portal, you can go into the solutions tab over here. And in your solutions tab, whichever solution you want to export with this pipeline, you'll have to pick the name field of that solution. Please note that we are not picking the display name field. We are picking the name field. So we'll have to put in this default if we had to actually export this default solution. So you pick this name field and you add it over here in the value. Once we're done with this, then our pipeline is finally eventually complete. And this is the complete pipeline which will help us to extract our code from our dev environments and push it over to Git. Now I'll stop my screen sharing over here, and we'll be shifting to another Word file which will outline the steps that we need to take in the next pipeline. I think we're running over time, but I'll just quickly go over the second pipeline so that you have the complete flow. Okay, so now hopefully you'll have the screen visible on our second Word document. This is the second pipeline. So I have split in our blogs on our website, on Imperium Dynamics website, where on the blog section I have written these blogs and these are split into the different pipelines that we have created. So this is the third blog in this series. The first one was related to the setup, which we did in the initial phase of this process, the Azure setup, the repository setup. The second blog will be related to the first pipeline which we just completed, and then this third blog is related to the second pipeline that we'll be building. So now we need to build another pipeline. The process remains the same as we did in the previous pipeline. This time the process will be a lot faster since we already know quite a lot of things from our first iteration of this process. Now you'll click on the pipelines button, you'll click on a new pipeline, and then you'll do the same steps over again. You'll use the classic editor once again, you'll use the Azure Git repos once again, and then you will create an empty job, and then you name the pipeline accordingly. Now this time, this pipeline, what it wants to achieve it is that it wants to take the code files on your source control system on your Git